Okay, so today we want to talk about. Okay, so I think what we want to talk about is the simple question. The Bible is full of, in fact, I would say, the number one concern throughout the Old Testament and really in the New Testament as well. Although the New Testament has this whole issue of like Jews and Gentiles being in the body of Christ together, and that drives a lot of the New Testament's theology. But certainly in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, there is an ongoing deep concern with the worship of idols. Okay? That's like the main issue. And it's, so all throughout Israel's history, and then in the New Testament, when Paul is getting after Christians for being too much like the world, it's always around this issue of worshiping idols, which really kind of then, I think, demands that we ask the question, what are idols? Like, what does that mean? Like, what is idolatry really in our context? Because you don't have, typically we don't have actual statues that we think are attached to various and sundry gods and things like that. So how does any of that stuff apply to us? And so the passage...
The clickbait title is, What Are Idols and Where Did They Go?
Yeah. What happened to all the idols? So you want to go back to traditional religion, do you? Okay, so I want to start with this, though, because this just is like a good example of a New Testament passage where it's like, what is going on here and how does it have anything to do with the 21st century? Okay, so in the book of Revelation, it opens with these 7 letters to these 7 churches before it gets into the really kind of psychedelic vision that John has. So at this point, he's just having a vision of Jesus. So Jesus shows up and tells John, I want you to write these things to these 7 churches, and he kind of goes through. So this is to the church in Pergamum, which is the 3rd church on the list. And so Jesus says to John here in this vision, and to the angel of the church in Pergamum, write, the words of him who has the sharp 2-edged sword. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and yet you hold fast my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans, whatever that is. Therefore, repent. If not, I will come to you and war against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. Okay, so there's a lot of weird things going on there. Some of them are somewhat decipherable, okay? So I just want to point out what some of those are. It says, you have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel. Okay, so this is a well-known story in the Old Testament, in the book of Numbers, where Balaam, I don't know if you know the story where the donkey talks, and right, mm-hmm. Okay. But the point is, it's a well-known story, and what happens in the aftermath of that, he tries to curse Israel, but he can't because God won't let him, and so he only blesses them. But what happens in the aftermath is that he kind of conspires together with this king who had hired him to do the cursing and gets them to figure out how to entice the Israelites into idol worship. But here it says, put a stumbling block before the children of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So there's something going on here. Eat food sacrificed to idols. That's not anywhere really explicit in the text of the Old Testament. But it's a going concern in the New Testament world, this issue of food sacrificed to idols. Anyway, so to me, it just there's a couple questions that to me come out of this that I think we should talk about. If you have a situation here where you've got this real church in Pergamum in the 1st century, and it's a real church because it's talking about Antipas, who was a member of the church there, who was killed, who was a martyr somehow in wherever they live in Pergamum. But it says, you dwell where Satan's throne is, and some of you are doing this Balaam thing of making it okay to eat food sacrificed to idols. Okay. So the question I have then for us in the 21st century is, what happened to Satan's throne? Is it still in Pergamum? Or is it somewhere else? Like, where would we want to write a letter? I mean, this is Jesus. Like, where might Jesus want to speak into someone's life and say, I know that you are in a context where Satan's got his throne. Like, where is that? You know, so somehow it's identified with Pergamum here, but like, where is Satan's throne today? Presumably he still has a throne somewhere because Jesus hasn't come back yet. And the other thing is, what is this issue of eating food sacrificed to idols? Now that we're living in the 21st century where there are no idols and no sacrifices that have been made to those idols, is this just kind of like, oh, sweet, it's a non-issue. It's like, this is no problem for us anymore. So let's just start with that, I guess, and see where we get in terms of how do you take something in that kind of context and make it relevant to today. Does Satan have a throne? Let's start with that.
Yeah. Oh, geez. I don't know. That's a big one. Trying to think of where to start. Does Satan have a throne? He's the prince of the power of the air. And he prowls around like a roaring lion. It's the two descriptions that come to mind. So to say that he has a throne is actually a little bit out of place for the typical descriptions that you think of him. He's sort of out causing mischief. He's not sort of ruling from somewhere where he's waving his arms around.
Although there are references to him being the ruler of this world.
Yeah.
You know, are you thinking that the throne of Satan in that context has a particular physical significance? Is it important that Satan have a throne that's physically somewhere?
Right.
I mean, he's certainly got a lot of footholds.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of places where he sits. He's got a lot of places where he rules from. Are any of them more important than the others?
Yeah, wow. So, I mean, what people that study the book of Revelation and the history and so forth will try to do is they'll try to figure out, like, yeah, is there something on the ground in Pergamum that is the kind of referent behind this, right? So, like, you know, there's a particularly big temple to the emperor or something like that. If you look at the archaeology and you go, okay, maybe that's what he's talking about. That, like, some particular pagan cult is particularly strong in this city, and that's what he means by Satan's throne, right? Because it's like, this is all obviously like against God. Which, okay, maybe that's one angle, but again, what would be even if that was the case, which it's not obvious that that's the best way, because it's clearly some kind of metaphor either way, since there was no actual temple that said like a temple to Satan. So either way, it's like you're mapping this idea of Satan's throne onto some other reality in the world that people don't think is Satan's throne. Either they think it's a pagan god, or they think it's whatever else it might be referring to. So
I think what I would assume if I just read that on my own is that it's referring to just, you might say, some other analogy, just to say that, like, basically you've thrown your lot in, or like that. What goes on there is all kind of nefarious. So you might, I don't know, be a good example of that.
Well, so maybe like you might say, I'm writing a letter to the church in Las Vegas where Satan has his throne.
Yeah, there we go.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a good kind of like similar analogy?
Yeah, you might kind of be saying somewhere.
I mean, it is called Sin City, so
quite
who's in charge
quite
of
obviously where things are just sort of depraved and sort of debauched, and you might say the devil's playground or something like that.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. There you go. See, so there's
a bit more of an expression than a literal.
Yeah, we
term.
use that metaphor, the devil's playground. What do we use that for usually? Just to describe an area as particularly debauched.
Yeah.
Or like,
yeah, it sounds like it'd be a nightclub.
Yeah, exactly, a nightclub. Yeah, exactly. So there's some kind of sin on the ground in Pergamum that's, so endemic that Jesus wants to talk about Satan having his throne there. But again, like none of the stuff that was going on, right? So they had food sacrificed to idols and these things, like none of that stuff applies to the world today. So like what's happened to it? I guess what I'm getting at is in the Bible there's this concern. There's always like the threat, I guess you could say, to human beings is that humans, instead of worshiping God, being faithful to God, and finding their identity in Christ, and before that, in their relationship with God in the Old Testament. The threat is they're going to go off after idols. They're going to go worship other things. They're going to chase these other sort of rival gods that aren't Yahweh. And what we've done, I feel like, in the 21st century is we've gotten rid of all those rival gods because we go, okay, well, there's no, there's no storm god like Thor or whatever, and there's no god of health. Asclepius doesn't actually exist, right? So the point is we live in this kind of scientific rationalistic society where we don't have any kind of spiritual or non-materialistic kind of explanation for anything that happens in the world, but we still want to hold on to belief in kind of like the creator God who created it all. But then it's like, okay, but then what? All that stuff just goes away. So what's the threat? Like, what is it that's actually threatening our identity as people who are supposed to be faithful? It's like, is it just all gone now? Has Christianity just kind of won in a sense, and we've driven out all those old demons? They're all gone.
When I was a kid, in a fairly conservative household, the idea of an idol would usually be thrown onto, well, you spend too much time on the computer. That's becoming an idol.
Right.
You're giving time to some inanimate object that's, basically sort of stealing your attention.
Yeah. Or some priority.
Yeah, it was a little bit, honestly, unsatisfying. Like, when I think of it, even now, it's like, it just seems like, that sounds like a fairly serious description for something kind of inconsequential,
Yeah.
Well, I think the idea of priority is an important one. Like I've always thought of it as, God's our priority. And you look at the Ten Commandments, right? Like, God is a jealous God. You're not going to have any other gods other than me. It seemed to me that concept of a God other than me is what is meant by idol. So then you go back to the TV example is a bit of a silly example that we use with our kids or whatnot, but there is a point there somewhere where I think if there's something that's stealing God's place of priority, in particular in your spirit, and I'll come back to how I think that you could do that, but if that happens, then you've got an idol. So how is it that you would be worshiping that idol instead of God? Well, I think if we rely on God as our primary source, He's our everything. He's what makes us who we are. He's the source of our identity. If there's anything that we go to that's not God to fill those things in us, I think that becomes an idol. And
Mm-hmm.
It could be television. I think it's probably more likely to be things like money, security, lustful gratification, like all of these things.
I think you actually hit it more, so the juices are flowing here. I'm starting to kind of get my thoughts after putting the kids to bed. So the word idol, as far as I know, it basically just means image. And so when it says that we were made in the image of God, that's actually a very similar word to be used.
Yeah.
So when he says, don't have other gods before me or don't make idols, he's saying is don't make another image in my place.
Right.
So,
or in your place. Like, you are the image.
Yeah. So what would be doing that? And I think it's really anything that takes the responsibilities and the personhood of God away from Him. So when you say security, there's the verse that says, I look to the mountains, where does my help come from? It comes from the Lord. If I'm looking to other things for help,
mm-hmm.
those things can then start to subvert and take the place of God in my life, and I think inadvertently become something of an idol. So safety, big one these days. Where do we look for our safety? Where do we look for security? I think that might be probably getting more in line with what the modern day idols would be. The new god of health.
Yeah, the new god of health. And,
but then you start to think about if that's what an idol is, you know, and we just follow that analogy through, like what would food sacrifice to an idol be?
Yeah. Yeah, so actually, to be honest with you, I think we've got to tease this out better.
Okay.
Because what I think we haven't done yet in the conversation is we have not differentiated between a god, like a false god, and an idol. Because those two things are wrapped up with each other very intimately, but they're not... I don't know. You need to draw a Venn diagram. It's like there's some place where they overlap, right? So in the Ten Commandments, when it says, "You shall not have any other gods before me," or like when Aaron says to the Israelites after he makes the golden calf, he says, "Here are your gods," or "Here is your God." So you can use in the Bible, they can use the word God to refer to the idol itself. Mm-hmm. But then there's also terminology and language for referring to the idol itself that's referring to the object that's not necessarily referring to the God that's supposed to be behind the object.
It would be sort of like the terms God and image of God.
Yeah. Anyways, I want to read a little passage here out of Deuteronomy because this, I think, shows that distinction. It's just, I mean, there's tons of places where you have this distinction. And I think it's an important distinction to make as we're trying to understand this idea of what does it mean to sort of like worship idols and the idea of food sacrifice to idols and stuff like that. So Deuteronomy 4, verse 9. So Moses has just reminded them, look, when you were... I'll back up a bit. So he says, he's kind of getting ready to lay out the whole Torah, the whole, all the law of God for them. And he says, your eyes have seen what Yahweh did at Baal Peor. So he's referring back to what happened when they followed... this thing with Balaam, right, that's in Revelation. So he's referring back to that. And he's like, a bunch of you basically worship false gods and God destroyed them all. But you who held fast to the Lord, which is also what you saw there in Revelation, right? You have held fast, right, even though others have been persecuted and so forth. You who held fast to Yahweh are alive today. See, I have taught you statutes and rulings as Yahweh my God commanded me that you should do them in the land you're entering to possess. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom in the sight of all the nations. Okay. So, only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Okay. Here's what he says. How? On the day, verse 10, chapter 4, verse 10. How on the day that you stood before Yahweh, your God, at Horeb, which is Deuteronomy always calls Sinai Horeb for some reason. Well, not for some reason. We're not going to get into it.
That's another podcast.
That's another... Okay. Yahweh said to me, gather the people to me that I may let them hear my words so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. You came and stood near at the foot of the mountain while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Then Yahweh spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. Listen to this. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, which is the Ten Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets, and he told me to give you other statutes and rulings so that you could put this all into practice. Therefore, watch yourselves carefully, since you saw no form on the day that Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you, this says act corruptly, you could say disintegrate, really. It's like, lest you basically just rot and fall apart by making a carved image for yourself. Okay, so now you're getting into this different language. Mm-hmm. So, lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourself in the form of any figure. This says likeness, but that's confusing because it makes you think of Genesis 1, but it's a different word. In Hebrew, this says something like a copy, or like, that's probably the best way to think of it, a copy. So making some carved image in the form of any figure, like a copy of male or female, or a copy of any animal that's on the earth, or a copy of any winged bird that flies in the air, or a copy of anything that creeps on the ground, or a copy of any fish that's in the water under the earth. And beware, now listen to this, lest your eyes turn to heaven and you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, and you're dragged away and you bow down to them and you serve them, the things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole of heaven. But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people for his own inheritance, or you could actually translate that as to be his own proprietary people. That's really the idea. Anyways, the point is, there's two things going on here. We don't want to be making any copies of any forms, of any like animals or people or fish or anything like that. And we don't want to be worshiping these things that we see in creation that kind of like present their forms to us, right? So we see the sun and the moon and the stars, the starry host. And the pagans would see those things and they would chase off and worship them. Mm-hmm. And Yahweh's like, no, you have to stay loyal to me. But there's two pieces of that loyalty. And one is, yeah, you don't go and start worshiping the sun, but you also don't make an idol. Like, those are two different things. And so it might be the case that the idol you make is an idol of the sun. And so this is like doubly a problem. But even if you were to make an idol to try to worship Yahweh, that would still be a problem. And that's what they did with the golden calf. That was the whole issue. And the reason why you can't do that is because when Yahweh shows up in the world to speak to you, as you've experienced, when he shows up in person, when he's able to come into this world without a form. That's not something any of the false gods do, okay? So, Baal, he's kind of this storm god, right? And he sends the rains, right? So it's like the effects of his activity are seen in the world. The rain comes, there's a storm. Mm-hmm. That's the idea. But if you want to, like, talk to Baal, if you want to give Baal a kind of like, give him some favors, feed him somehow to make him happy so that he'll send you more rains when you want them. You can't do that. Baal can't get into the creation. He's somewhere up there in the celestial realm. He's probably, the ancient people would think he's one of these starry hosts probably. Yeah. But, so he's somewhere up there in the celestial realm. But if we want to have access to him down here, we're going to create this copy of a cow, which is going to be this kind of form that he can inhabit, and then we can have access to him. And Yahweh says, that ain't how it works with me. I just showed up, and I didn't need any form to show up in. I have access to creation in person, and I can speak to you whenever you need. And it's really now through Moses, right? And so that's the story that's told. Moses starts getting these commandments and statutes because the people don't want to hear God directly all the time. But the point is, it's still coming from the same presence. And there's no form because God doesn't come in to creation by means of a form. So you better not be making any of these forms. And you better not be worshiping any of these other things that are out there because... Yeah. Okay, so those are two different things. And when you're talking about a food sacrifice to an idol, the idea is you've got this idol that's supposed to be granting you access to the presence of whoever it is, Apollos or something, okay? Or not Apollos, Apollo. Apollos is an apostle in the New Testament. Apollo. So you're trying to gain favors from that god, and so you sacrifice this animal and you somehow present it to this image, this idol. But you're after this God that's somehow in the celestial realm, and you're trying... Okay, so that's the thing you got to keep in mind, this distinction between what is this idol that is supposed to be a means of kind of like obtaining and containing and constraining the presence of God versus the thing itself that it's trying to contain. So to your point, this is very long-winded, but I
like the expression, just throw it in before we go past it, but they say they worship the things of God, not the God of the things.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, but to your point, so you're saying sometimes we worship security, right? And that's true, we do. I would want to make a distinction, though. When we're worshiping security is like this thing that's out there that we want. And so you could write it with a capital S. Security is a kind of a force of something, It's some reality, anyways, that we think exists that we could obtain the favor of. in some sense. And so even though we don't think of it as like a being with like any kind of personality or anything like that, if we're pursuing it that way, we're sort of treating it like it's a god, right? The same way that an ancient person, like they wanted to pursue health, and so they like came up with Asclepius. It's like that's how you pursue health. Good health is you and healing. So it's the same thing. We want to worship security. Then the question is, how do we get security? So security is out there to be had. And there's some force of security that, like, you know, I look around the world and I see, wow, that guy is way more secure than that guy. The God of security is favoring that guy more than that guy. So now you try to figure out, okay, what do you got to do? Well, we don't sit and make sacrifices and do silly superstitious things because we know better. We're so smart and we're scientific and we understand all these things. But we still have people who will tell us, well, here's how you get more security.
Yeah.
Here's how you get more security. You do X, Y, Z and you'll get more security. And it's never 100% foolproof because nothing ever is. But it's like, yeah, we can be pretty successful at it. So then the point being, okay, so we have something we want, this reality, this kind of like force in the world. We chase after that instead of chasing after God, the true God. We chase after that thing. And when we chase after it, we do so by some means. There's some means of gaining that other thing. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's two levels of the whole thing is what I'm trying to say. That we divert our priority away from the God of creation who made us in his image and who we find our identity in. We divert that to some other thing. Then there's a host of means by which we pursue that other thing that are meant to bring the presence of that other thing into our lives. So to me, that would be how to think about the idea of an idol. And then, I guess you could say food sacrificed to an idol would be any kind of thing which is sort of offered in the service of that procurement, of that mechanism for gaining those benefits.
Yeah.
So, does that kind of clarify, I guess? I don't know.
So, now maybe I'm thinking of this line wrong. I think in the church we often discount the gifts and the abilities that God gives man. So, like doctors, I mean, that's probably a really good example in Christendom is the idea. It's like, no, God will take care of me. I don't need Tylenol, or something. So they'll often reject any sort of scientific advancements in the name of, no, I don't. That's witchcraft and whatever. I sort of don't. But then you'll read things like, I think it's when basically God says, or Jesus says, like, I'm here, and you can read the signs of the stars. You're smart, basically. How did you miss it? It's kind of the comment he's making. Yeah. Now, I don't know if he's saying that a little facetiously or not, but the idea is like he's giving some credit to, you're intelligent people. You've got all the things that you need to see the signs and to know, and you've missed this as coming or whatever. So where does the line get drawn? So so let's say you're saying security, and offering to it resources, money. If you're buying a security system for your home, are you removing from God, your safety and relying on your own means, or is there some room for what would be considered reasonable precaution?
Right.
It's just that.
No, I mean that's kind of that's the ethical question that you got to figure out in your own life. But I think the deeper point, though, is that these things have some kind of reality, right? Like, we don't have the same names for these gods, but we still want all the same thing, right? The ancient people wanted good crops. They wanted good health. They wanted, right? It's like they wanted the good life. That's what they wanted, just like everybody does. And they're trying to get that from all the powers that they perceive in the world. And we're no different. We do the same thing. And so then the question is, okay, do any of these powers have any kind of reality? Because this is getting back to the whole issue of Satan's throne. It's like, we've gotten rid of, Thor and Zeus and all these pagan gods, but have we gotten rid of Satan? Like, have we gotten rid of the real, actual spiritual powers that really do exist in the world, that really do try to distract us and gain our attention away from God, because Paul would say that those powers are precisely what's behind those idols, even though the idols have no real means of connecting to them. They're still the powers that are there. So once we've gotten rid of, Apollo and don't have his idols around anymore, but Paul says there was a demon back there somewhere in the mix. So where's that demon? And does that demon continue to inhabit the things that we try to value above God, in the sense of making gods and idols in our lives? Is there a real spiritual implication beyond, your priority is misplaced, you should care more about God than you care about that? Or is it more like, wow, you're kind of hanging out with a demon over there? You probably shouldn't do that.
So, what do some of these things take the form of today? I guess that's the driving question. Where are they now, if they're not plainly held up as individual beings?
Before we change gears, can we go back? I'm interested in, you made a point earlier about there's sort of the Venn diagram of the idol and the false god, and I get what you're saying. But I keep coming back to, isn't the offensive part of either of those things the same? Neither of them is God.
Right.
So if you make an idol that's supposed to represent God, and you miss out on connecting with God and being in His presence, you're doing the wrong thing. And if you're worshiping something that's just not God, you're doing the wrong thing.
Right.
And I think those are two kinds of idols, but they're wrong for the same reason, I think.
Right.
In that they prevent us from communing with the one true God. So then, to bring it back to security, and this is something, you guys know, I've been thinking about this a lot. If security is what I want, and I pursue that through any other vehicle than the one true God, I believe I'm sinning.
Right.
Meaning, if I put my faith and my hope in my job, in my employer, in my position,
mm-hmm.
for me, that's an idol. I know that. And the reason I know that is because I've done that before.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost killed me. And we won't get into that today. But I think you guys have heard this story before. So I can't do that. I can't put my faith in those things. For me, I know they're idols. And I also know that doing certain things in pursuit of satisfying my employer so I can get security would be the same as consuming food sacrificed to that idol of security.
Right.
That's why I can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
I think you want to say doing certain things to satisfy your employer and for no other reason.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I don't have another reason.
Right.
That would be my
Right.
reason. Honestly, that would be my reason.
Right.
And I know that's a sin for me.
Right.
Because I've lived it. I've done it already.
Yeah.
And God saved me from it. And why would I take my freedom and put myself back in chains?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think the only distinction I would make, the reason why I want to maintain the distinction between the idol and the God is that, as if you look at the passage I just read in Deuteronomy, the idea is, look at, you're Yahweh's people.
Mm-hmm.
But he also says, I took you out of the iron furnace. Well, what's that about? That's a weird kind of metaphor. Well, what's going on is, this is how you make an idol. You melt down some things,
mm-hmm.
and then you take it out and you form it into something. So basically Yahweh's saying, no, you're the image, right? Israel is supposed to be, and Jesus really becomes, and the rest of the body of Christ now is kind of in the same position, where we are, right? So God comes into the world. He doesn't need any kind of a form, but he chooses this people so that they become the means by which he is seen by the rest of the nations. But so they see God by seeing Israel,
Right.
in the same way that they thought they were going to see these other gods by seeing their idols. So the reason I want to maintain the distinction is God's basically saying, look at, you don't chase after the sun, moon, and stars. You belong to Yahweh. That's basically saying, look, your identity comes from me, and I made you to reflect my identity in the world. But then the first half of that is, don't make this form. So they are kind of together, but they're not exactly the same thing in the sense that the first half of it basically says, don't give that identity to something else. So don't reject your identity and transfer it onto an object. Don't do that. But also don't derive your identity from something that's not me. Mm-hmm. So they're moving in different directions. One is, I'm taking an identity from the sun, moon, and stars that I shouldn't be taking, because I should be taking my identity from Yahweh. The other is, I'm taking that identity that I've received from Yahweh and I'm transferring it onto an object.
Yep.
And I shouldn't be doing that, because both of those compromise who it is that I'm called to be, which is a reflection of God in the world.
Sure. Don't give away your inheritance.
Right? So that's why I want to maintain the distinction, because I think those behaviors kind of consist in different... So an example would be, let's say money is the God, okay? Mm-hmm. Money is the God. Then what the admonition would be like, don't take your identity from wealth. So you don't look to wealth to give you an identity of who you are. Your identity comes from God. Okay, perfect. I've got my identity from God. Now that I'm all secure with my identity from God, and God has blessed me so richly, I'm going to, have gold-plated toilet seats or whatever. Yeah. It's like, no, hold on, because now you're expressing...
Like a super fancy, ostentatious car.
Or whatever it is, right. Yeah, some kind of an object. Because what you're doing now is you're expressing your identity through these objects instead of expressing God's identity through you into the world.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's a thing, and people criticize some of the big TV pastors for doing that. They get the big ostentatious house or car or wife or whatever it is.
Or wife.
That's a thing.
It's true.
So,
you see what I'm saying, though? So it's it's a subtle nuance, but I do think it kind of matters in a way. I'm trying to think how that fits to your thing.
It does matter, although I do think it's a different sin, right? I think the sin in that example is giving away your inheritance.
Right.
Taking what God's put inside you, either us as individuals or us as God's people or God's church.
Yeah. And
taking that and putting it into something else and making people look at that and say, well, that's the representation. That God's blessed me because I drive this ostentatious car.
Right.
So you should see the glory of God in that car. That's not what God wants. God wants people see the glory of God in you.
That's right. Yeah. And the issue is they can't see the glory of God in the car. So
right.
At the crux of it, for Israel in Deuteronomy 4, the crux of it is, you guys are helping me write my dissertation right now, by the way. So.
Awesome. Put it in the footnote.
Well, so I was going to say, I kind of think there's a line, and it's because it's not that we want to say, well, nice cars are bad, but there's a difference, right? There is a difference. There is the image that the nice car gives, versus just, there's guys that are just motorheads and they just appreciate a nice car.
Sure, yeah.
The craftsmanship, those are the gifts that God gives us to create beautiful things, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a big line there. There's just, and that just comes from everyone's heart. Why?
Right.
Because you could do the same damage with a way less expensive car.
Right.
Right. There's people that drive real crap boxes, taking an identity from that. Right. So it doesn't. You don't need to spend a lot of money on the car to be committing the same thing. And one other thing. So these are more modernized versions. I was just rolling it around a little bit. That verse about not making an image or trying to create something, which I believe that's always the reason that most Protestant churches won't put up, Jesus on a cross image.
Right. Yeah.
Really, there's no made image typically in most Gentile churches, other than quite the opposite is the Catholic churches. It's all over. They wear the cross with him on it.
Oh, and they have images of everything.
Well, so it was funny because you were saying. Gods of things. You know who St. Christopher is? Yeah, God of
Patron
well,
saint of
yeah,
travel.
traveling mercies or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like quite literally, it's like, why did we need that?
Right. Well, because
So here we are in Christendom, coming up with these.
Well, okay, so that's
basically-
interesting though. Okay, you're
These
right.
are way more obvious versions of that. Like, or maybe I should just say more honest versions of that, where it's. You
All
know,
right. You
why,
really
why
wanna-
wouldn't you just say, "Lord, give me traveling mercies"?
Well,
why do
so-
you need it through Him? I mean,
Well,
and who is
because-
He?
Well,
Because no, hold on. I'm going to answer your question because this is very important. You ready for this? Let's go to Exodus 19. Okay, Exodus 19. They get to Mount Sinai. They've come out of Egypt. Okay. Yahweh calls to Moses out of the mountain, and he says, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel." Now, this is the offer, okay? God's going to make an offer they can't refuse. This is the offer. Hey, Moses, go make this offer to the Israelites. If they like the offer, they can take the offer and we'll get on with it. If they
Deal or
don't,
no deal.
if they don't, then don't take it. Here's the offer. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my, and I'm going to give you the right translation here, you shall be my private property amongst all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. But you shall be for me a royal administration of priests and a holy nation. The point is, God is the king of the universe. But he doesn't, in the Bible, this is what's very interesting to me. In the Bible, God does not, like, we have this idea of God that it's just like he's everywhere at all times and he's in everything and he's just responsible for everything. And it's like, on some level, I guess that philosophically seems like it has to be true, but that's just never the way the Bible describes how God works. God always has this council, you know, like you read in the book of Job. He's up there with these other people, and they're like having some court together, and then the accuser comes in, and God's like, "Hey, have you checked out Job lately?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, he only is nice to you because you're nice to him. I bet he wouldn't do that if you messed up his life." Okay, well, let's find out. You know, they're having this conversation, and they're like coming up with plans. You see it in the book of Kings, you know, they're trying to figure out what to do about how to, you know, entice some king into going into battle that will get him killed. And somebody comes along and says, "I'll do it. I'll be a lying spirit, and we'll trick him into going into this battle." And then God's like, "Okay, yeah, that sounds like a good plan." So then he goes down and tricks him. Well, so what's happening is, now, okay, so they're going to be the royal administration. The point is, yeah, the king of the universe has a royal administration. And that's the idea in Genesis 1. It's like God's the ruler of all the world, and he wants to tell the plants how to grow, and he wants to tell the animals how to do whatever it is that they're going to do. Like, you know, he wants to control everything. He wants to control where viruses go and don't go, and he wants to control, like, all this stuff is supposed to be within his control, but how's he going to do it? He's going to delegate it. He's going to have this administration, just like a king has an administration. It's like you're the minister of public health, and you're the minister of, you know, defense, and you're the minister. So you have all these different ministers. So the reason why Christendom has come up with these patron saints, I'll give you the answer. So God says to Israel, "You're going to be my royal administration." Well, that's really saying something, because the way the whole conception is, okay, so back to Deuteronomy 4, where he says, you can't look up at the hosts of heaven, right? The sun and the moon and the stars and the host of heaven, and be drawn away and bow down and serve them. Things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole earth. So the hosts of heaven, you know, they didn't know that stars were gaseous, you know, giant things. They looked up there and they saw the celestial realm. That's what they're looking at. And that's what it says in Genesis 1. God made the greater light to rule the day. This is, you know, it has a function, the same function humans are going to have in the earth, the sun somehow has in the sky. It's in charge. God puts it in charge. God's like, you know, I don't have time to sit around managing daytime. I want to put this other light in charge. He's going to rule the day. Okay, so he has this administration, and this administration consists of all these celestial beings. And that's clear in Scripture. But what God says to Israel is, look, I'm going to make you into my royal administration. And then, essentially, you're going to replace the current administration. Like, you're going to become the minister of daylight. And, you know, I'm going to redistribute those roles away from these celestial beings who, by the way, messed up back in Genesis 6, right? Like, that's why there's this whole thing about the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, and right? So it's like there's something messed up both with humanity and with the whole celestial kind of royal administration of God. And so his whole new plan is to create this new people who's going to fix the human problem on the earth so that his rule on earth is set up properly. But then, lo and behold, of all the crazy ideas, that human royal administration, in addition to ruling the earth, is also going to get to take over the whole, like they're actually going to be God's kind of key administration for the whole kit and caboodle. Okay, so the sun, moon, and stars are appointed to all the other nations under heaven, but Israel goes with God. And what's really amazing is that you get to this poem in Deuteronomy 32. Let's see here if I can find it. Okay, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the divine beings. Right? So he arranged the nations of the world, and he said, okay, you are the minister of, Pakistan. No, it wasn't our modern nations. But he fixed the borders, and he put these divine beings in charge of all of them. What's amazing is that there's actually disagreement amongst the manuscripts about what that should say. And the reason why there's a disagreement is because of the way the theology works. That is how it was set up, but it's supposed to become Israel. And so there are several manuscripts that actually say that you fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel, as opposed to the divine beings. And that's just evidence of this whole conversation. And then you see it in lots of places. I mean, this is clearly the picture that emerges. So the reason why the church ends up with these patron saints of all these things is because they're going like, yeah, okay, so God's going to take his new humanity, which eventually comes out from Israel and gets other Gentiles and everybody grafted in. So now you have this body of Christ who's like this new humanity, who's God's royal administration for overseeing everything in creation, including things like safety when you travel. There used to be a demon that dealt with that. And then people ran off and started to worship that demon and made idols of it and tried to give it stuff to get its favor, not realizing that actually that power was just part of God's kind of royal overseeing of the universe. And so the church kind of develops this doctrine where they're like, well, if there's this shift, if there's like a new administration coming in, who's he given the power to? Which of the members of the body of Christ? Who's the minister of health while you travel? Well, it must be St. Christopher. So that's theologically where it comes from. It's not like they're not just coming up with craziness. There's a biblical basis for it. Now, it's a bit, I think, silly to act as if we could all sit down here and know, oh yeah, God put this particular human who's now died in charge of this area of his, administration of the cosmos. But I think that is the biblical way to think about God in the world and our place in it, is that God is administering the cosmos, and there's other powers by which he does that. And so to bring it back to this whole conversation of idolatry, when we start worshiping those other powers, we're supposed to be having our allegiance to the king, but it's almost like we're sort of like setting up a coup in a way, right? Where it's like, you know what, instead of having my allegiance to, the king, I'm going to go and try to make this lower level minister the king. And worship him as if he's the king. Like, that's the picture. So I don't know how that applies to, like, our modern day situation.
Well, I think one way is, and I appreciate the analogy of demons used to be in charge of this thing, right? So,
well, the thing to keep in mind, I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
Because demon is a really negative sounding word, but in the Bible, it's a neutral word. It just means a kind of a deity, a power.
Right.
Like in Greek, a daimon. Well, eudaimonia, which is the Greek word for happiness, just means a good demon.
Yeah.
So happiness is a power in the
Fair
universe.
enough, but not God.
Right, exactly,
right?
yeah.
So, which is where I'm going. Because we were talking before about security and the idol of security. And I was thinking about it because of my own situation, you think about it in terms of financial security. But you could do the same thing with emotional security, or specifically where my mind is going is health security.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what are we doing right now? Who are we bringing gifts to? And we're laying down at the feet of what? To give us security
Well,
in
I think
a
the
healthy
better
sense.
term would be, what are we sacrificing?
Yeah.
What are we giving up? What are we willing to hand over for this said
But
security and
who
safety?
are we giving it to? Like, again, like, are we putting our trust in God, or is it an idol? And you can call the idol like whatever you want, but like I think the easy examples are, like I think an uneasy example could be vaccines. Are we worshiping an idol? Is that what we're putting our faith in? Is that what we're putting our trust in? Is that what we're putting our hope in? And what are we laying at the feet of that idol? And I recognize that that's, potentially an inflammatory statement, but
Very controversial.
but we have to talk about that stuff. Like, we have to talk about that as Christians, because if we're worshiping a false god,
Yeah.
we are in deep trouble, and we have to help each other not do that.
Yeah. Here's where, to me, though, the rubber meets the road on the issue. So that's fine. Okay, let's take vaccines because it's like, we can not beat around things and just be concrete. That's fine. The question I want to ask is what are the identity implications and where are they when it comes to that whole question, right? Because it's one thing to say we're trying to save ourselves from a virus by putting our trust in, right? So a verse that might apply here is this, I think it's in Isaiah, right? Where he says, some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Okay, but that's not idolatry. At least not in that context. Horses and chariots aren't idols. They're man-made things that you shouldn't trust in. But the way Isaiah is talking about them, he's not comparing God to false gods and idols. He's comparing God to, man-made attempts at, whatever the goal is that you have in mind. Okay, so that's like a third distinction. So, but I agree with you that there is an implication of idolatry, and not just, trusting in horses and chariots. Mm-hmm. But I want to tease that out. Like, what is it about the whole, vaccine debate where it becomes a question about your identity, either where you're getting your identity from or what you're kind of surrendering your identity to in a way that makes your function as one who represents God in the world sort of like not work, right? Because that's the whole issue of Israel making an idol and putting their identity on the idol, is that the whole point of Israel is God wants to come into the world so others can see him and interact with him through his image, which is supposed to be us. And if we transfer that kind of function onto something that cannot contain God and cannot represent him, then essentially we've cut off access. And now no one can see God anymore because they were supposed to see him in us, and instead we put this other thing there and that didn't work. So, right? So where are those implications, do you think, in something like the issue of vaccination? Where is there an issue of us either deriving our identity from something other than God, or surrendering our identity in a way that makes God inaccessible, who would have otherwise been accessible through us?
Well, I think there's two aspects that come to mind immediately. One is, I believe that there are people who are worshiping vaccines to the point where it's just evident, like with the stickers or the T-shirts, or I saw somebody with, a gold chain with "vaxxed" on it. It's one of the this is somebody who's a governor of somewhere. Like that, I think is just clear cut. Like I'm wearing a cross and I'm wearing a T-shirt that has Isaiah on it, Isaiah 41:10. If this T-shirt said, vaxxed and happy and safe, or, like the reason that the chain caught my attention was it's the same font that I've seen where people have the chain that says blessed.
Yeah.
It says vaxxed.
No, it's probably the trope that it's...
Yeah. So that's a clear example. So I think that there is a danger of just literally idolizing the vaccine and having it be part of your identity. Like there's people who
Right.
like the Team Pfizer, Team Moderna shirts, like all of these things. Like
Right.
that, I think is just clear.
Okay, so let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
I'm wearing a shirt here too. It says the New England Patriots on it.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. It's like your shirt and your cross, right? Like these things say something. You know, even the fact that we're wearing jeans as opposed to something else we might be wearing. Well, that we're wearing jeans and not dresses, that says something, right? Like everything about what we're presenting it somehow tells you something about what we're presenting in terms of our identity, right? And so you're saying, okay, I've got this shirt that shows you that my identity is based on God, it's based on Jesus, as we have this cross here, although of course lots of people wear a cross without meaning that. But the point is, like, that's why you're doing it. So it's like, okay, I'm kind of presenting what's my inner identity, and that inner identity is rooted in Christ. Okay, mission accomplished. But now I'm wearing a shirt that says New England Patriots, which actually says something about my identity. It absolutely tells you something about my identity. It's part of the story of who I am, which is all an identity really is. And the story of who I am includes the fact that I have family who are from Boston, and I cheer for Boston sports teams, and I like to watch football, right? So this is all part of the story of who I am, and I'm presenting that identity. How is that different from a T-shirt that says, I got vaxxed? Like, you know, I'm into that. That's part of the story of who I am. I guess my question is,
Well,
is it incompatible for the story of who I am to include cheering for the New England Patriots? And if it's not, why is it incompatible for the story of who I am to include getting vaccinated? See what I'm saying?
yes, I do see what you're saying.
I'm not trying to challenge you.
No,
I just think
and
there'd
I
be a
think
really
there's an
interesting answer to this question.
Yeah. No, I think that there is an answer to that question. It goes back to what we were talking about before. Like, why are you wearing the New England Patriots shirt? Like, what does it say about your identity? What are you putting the hope in the Patriots for? Is it for your life? Is it for your health? Is it for your security? Or is it because you like Boston sports teams? If it's the latter, I don't believe it's idolatrous. If it's the former, I think it definitely is.
I think it depends whether or not I bet on the game.
I don't know if it's as obvious as like security or whatever, but some, like it really can just be identity, right?
Yeah.
Some people just take a lot of. I know a few that take a lot of their who I am is based on the team you cheer for. I mean, we make fun of people for cheering for another team.
That's true.
Right? We will razz on people and say, "Oh, you're not a real man. You cheer for the Canadians." Or, you know, it's like we feel manhood is connected to the team you cheer for, right? So there is definitely, it can be a real identity link to your team or even the sport you choose or everything. So I do think, whatever, people casually wear a shirt because they go, "Hey, I like how." I would not wear my favorite team shirt if I just didn't like how it looked, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so. You can wear a shirt just because it's kind of like, I like how it looks, I like the team, whatever, you know. But you can also, and so I mean, it's just a heart thing. You can do the same damage with something far less obvious.
Yeah.
You can do more damage or no damage with something that would seem obvious.
So what do you think is the identity that's being expressed in a T-shirt that says I'm vaccinated or whatever?
I put my hope and trust in the vaccine.
So then this is a question I wonder for people that would say that, and I'm not going to say that you don't.
Way.
Yeah.
So we've only still gotten through the first, because I was going to say two things.
Well, this is why I was asking you
first
what's
thing.
the identity that's expressed, because I feel like there's some other thing that we haven't got.
There
to.
is, yeah. So, and I'm not trying to like pick on the Patriots. The New England Patriots are a fine football team, but and you guys know I have a sore point about this too. There's two issues. Like, one is if you're putting your hope and trust and faith in the New England Patriots to give you something that you should be getting from God, I think that's idolatrous.
Right.
The other way that I think it could be idolatrous is if you wear that shirt at church instead of wearing the clothing of God's grace, then you're not representing yourself in the image of God the way that He intends and the way that He wants. I think that's like making an idol,
Right.
right?
Well, or at the very least, yeah. If
Giving
you're wearing,
giving away your inheritance, but
yeah,
the result of it is, I always think of the example of like when somebody comes into church on a Sunday. You know, we always talk about new families coming in, and you know, what's their first impression of the church going to be? I want them to see Jesus,
yeah,
and I don't want anything to distract from that. And you know, I love the football teams, but if somebody comes in and sees, you know, like
the jersey or whatever.
yeah, or to bring it back to the vaccines. This is why I had such a hard time with the idea of a vaccine passport at church.
Yeah.
If that's the first thing that people see coming in, they would be right to conclude that that's the most important thing in our lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's I like agree with what you're saying, like on some level, but it's like, how do you avoid being legalistic, right? Because what you're not saying is like, thou shalt not wear jerseys in church. You know, that's a law, and everyone that doesn't follow it is outside the will of God. It's like, that's legalism, right? And nobody wants that. But I also agree with the point you're making.
I got a question for Tony, and then I have some views on that. So where do you draw a line? So if you know, vaccinated, this is where I think a lot of people are. You know, do you have other vaccinations or immunizations or things like that, or would you rely on doctors for other things? I know I like it, and I don't have a set like answer for that, and I'm not trying to like trap. Because I do feel like there is something different about this scenario.
Mm-hmm.
It is a little different. But what do you feel is the difference? It's what I'm curious. Because I am. It's kind of funny. So I got vaccinated, and I just did whatever. Like, I didn't do it right away. I didn't want to wait in a line. I got it when it was, like, easy, convenient, and I just thought, inevitably I'm going to have to get this thing, so I'll just get it. My brother didn't get it. He still hasn't. And I said, why didn't you get it? And he said, and he kind of delayed. And he goes, I don't really have that much of a problem with it, but I don't want to get it because now I'm being told I have to get it.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, I'd probably feel similarly about it. If I was being coerced, that it's like, no, basically, you're an outsider. If you don't, I'd be like, well, screw you, I'm not getting it.
Yeah.
I'd probably feel differently about it. The fact that I just kind of got it when I got it was like, okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I have everything else. I had no qualms about that. I don't really believe it's doing anything for me.
So
other
at
than
the
allowing
time,
me to
that's
continue my life
important
normally.
though. That's important though. So at the time, you were putting it in the category of your measles vaccine and your other like.
Yeah,
it's just
I was just like, you know what? I don't have
there's
any
kind
real
of a
convictions
whole-
about this. It's just whatever.
Yeah, it's like
Just
there's a
get
whole
on with it,
system of
please.
health
Like-
that we live in within Canada where we have regular doctor's appointments and we have, you know, after we turn a certain age, they start doing cancer screenings
So-
and they do, right? So there's this whole system of health that we're just all kind of a part of. And
Right.
it's
Well,
all-
you know what's funny about it is I have my vaccinations. I don't want to get the QR thing. I'll be falling into the category of the unvaxxed now, just because I don't like
right.
the
So
idea.
so what is that?
Well, so I don't like this sort of tracking movements, and like to me that's sort of crossed a line, and not in any spiritual sense, but just from a government overreach sense, where I look at that and I go, well, yeah, no, thank you. I'm not really, and whatever people go, oh, they can track you on your phone, this that. Well, yeah, but I bought this.
Yeah.
You know?
They're tracking
Now
you
I'm being
anyways.
forced
Yeah,
to
they're tracking you
live my life freely, and have my movements tracked, and I'm saying yes, that's okay, right? And so I just go, well, I guess I'm not eating at restaurants anymore.
I mean, the thing is, you're being tracked anyways. Like, that's not the issue. I think the problem with the vaccine tracking has to do with there's something about your identity that's accessible to somebody on your phone. Google knows an awful lot about who you are, and they can target ads at you, and they can, right? And it's like you're kind of, by even owning the phone or whatever, you're just like agreeing to that arrangement that my identity is going to kind of be tracked, and that's going to result in
It's still not
certain
directly in the
efficiencies in
hands of
communication
the
or whatever.
government.
Well, and it's also not my identity is going to be tracked on the basis of my vaccination status. That's weird. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know
Right?
how much I care about that, but yeah, like, just voluntarily saying, okay, so for
Well,
my
and it
convenience, I'm going to let you know where I am because I want to use the map and I want to whatever. Okay, I guess that's fine. I can also turn this off. I can go out to dinner still without you finding me. I can whatever, right? I mean, Visa knows where I tap.
That's right.
But that's fairly closely held information. That's not just the person who decides whether or not they think I deserve certain freedoms at this point. That's where we're at. Gets to know what I do with my day, right?
But it also makes it, by definition, the most important part of my identity.
Right.
The thing that people care about, the thing that people see first. That's all they want to see.
Right.
That is not the most important part of my identity. The most important part of my identity is Jesus Christ.
Right.
And I will not wear anything on top of Jesus Christ.
Right. Yeah, I think an analogous situation would be like just think about forms of identity, right? So
sorry. So before you get into that, I did have part 2 of that. So talking about things you wear at church.
Yeah.
Everybody decides what they're going to wear when they go to church, some way or another. Certain things get more attention than others. I'll start with the things that get attention. Teenagers tend to have the biggest arguments when it comes to what to wear. Mm-hmm. And I would say it's because they're the most honest about it. Why won't you fix your hair? Why are you wearing this? It's because I don't want to look like something that I don't
identify with.
I'm very conscious about how people are going to view me, and I want to be seen in a certain way. Right. So there's very much an identity linked to that.
100%.
I do the same thing, but mine's a lot more acceptable. I want to be seen as an adult. I want to be taken seriously. I don't want to look like a kid. I quite purposely do not dress like that. This is a hard thing for me at work. I have a young face. Like I'm dealing with people that are 50 and 60 years old with lots of money. Mm-hmm. I actually go well out of my way to dress a certain way.
Do you wear fake glasses to make you look older? I used to do that. I had plain glass and a pair of glasses.
I'm funnily enough, I'm playing the same game, really. Yeah. I want people to view me a certain way, and I mean, some of that's just language. It's body language. It's, whether or not you'd say maybe there's a difference in the identity linking there. It's just a matter of I'm trying to get you to hear the words I'm saying in the way I want you to receive them. And if I wear certain clothes, you won't hear me. Yeah. Right? It's kind of like if you do street ministry, it's best not to wear a suit. Sometimes it's best to sort of dress down a little, be a little less threatening. There's language in that. But when it comes to the teens and stuff like that, yeah, there's definitely... very purposefully. No, I want to be, skateboarder, or, I want people to see me as a skateboarder, so I wear the clothes of a skateboarder, I wear the shoes, or I'm a rock star, so I grow my hair and I wear, Led Zeppelin shirts, or whatever. And so, to Tony's point, especially in the environment of a church where that... I do agree. I think it can definitely go the other way with the suit and everything. Sometimes that's an identity thing, and some of the more conservative churches, it's
don't show up without dressing up. Yeah.
I used to go to a camp, Boys Gym Club of America in Lake Chautauqua in Pennsylvania. Where do you go? I think it's Pennsylvania. And so they would do. It's a boys' camp, and it was a Christian camp, and. So they would do every Sunday, they have gospel teams. And so kids would learn all week different ministry related things. Some of them were magic tricks, and there was always gospel messages. It was great. Yeah. Start when you're 8 years old. So you're 8 years old, you're going out to these you go to these local churches. Some of them were far, you go out of state. But you drive out, sometimes stay the night, whatever. And I remember hearing a story of this little one room, I just felt like real all-American. Just little one-room church building. It's on a dirt road somewhere, and it's got the wood pews, and there's a little thing up the front there, the pulpit. Anyway, I forget. I heard it from one of the guys. Rumor had it anyhow. Somebody at this church had said they had these really it was 100-year-old building, I guess, and had the pews there, and so people had said, "Oh, we should get rid of these, put chairs in, and because it's more comfortable, or whatever." And one of the old fogies in there said, if we get rid of these pews, the Holy Spirit will leave our congregation. That's, taking things to the next level where it's kind of like you're taking a little bit too much in. And some of them, they feel that way. It's like, if you show up to church, I've said this before because I grew up in a fairly conservative church. And I remember there was these twins, these brothers, they seemed really old, but they were probably only in their 20s. and I think their mom must have gone there, and so they visited. And they came, and they both were wearing kind of like plaid button-ups. Remember? I remember looking at them at the ripe age of 8 and thinking to myself, are they saved? They showed up to church without a suit and tie. And I remember thinking, they must not be Christian. I'd be like, there's no way. So, I mean, something goes wrong there where we link the identity of being one of God's own to whether or not you wear a tie or no tie on a Sunday morning. And that can be the other way. But when you feel that showing up on a Sunday morning, what I need people to know about me is I cheer for the Patriots. You kind of have to go, okay, what's going on there, right? Even if it's not super overt, it's subconscious, right?
But I do want to, and I want to bring this back to the idolatry conversation and, food sacrificed to idols. You can help me with the reference, but there's a part where Paul talks about, like, don't cause a brother to stumble, don't eat. You don't have to worry about eating food that's sacrificed to idols because it's not going to hurt you. But don't do it if it's going to cause somebody else to stumble. And if it's sacrificed to an idol, you probably shouldn't eat it.
Right.
So to bring it back to the analogy of wearing the football jersey, and there's another part, and I think it's in James, where the writer says, if somebody knows that that something's not right and they do it anyway, then for that man, that's a sin. For that reason, I can't, I wouldn't personally wear, a sports jersey to church,
right?
Because for me, I know it would be a misprioritization.
Right.
So I don't, you asked before about how do you avoid legalism. Well, I think is, you don't assume everybody needs to do things exactly the way you're doing them. And you don't have to force it or impose that on people. And I'm not trying to say, I'd never want to propose a rule that says you can't wear a sports jersey to church. And I pray that anybody who wears a sports jersey to church isn't consciously going, I'm putting this on top of the garb of Jesus Christ. They're just picking something out of the closet. And so for them, it's not a sin. And I don't need to call them out on sinning because they're not sinning. So I think that's how you avoid the legalism. But for me, I can't.
Right.
Because it would be like eating food sacrificed to an idol. Because I know for me that food was sacrificed to an idol.
I like to say, after, because as a kid I was the same way, where as a teen you want to wear the clothes that represent you and whatever. Yeah. And I remember I came across it at some point where I thought, if you're going to go play hockey with your friends, you wear hockey equipment. If you're going to go scuba diving, you wear scuba gear.
Yeah.
If you go to a wedding or a funeral, you'll probably dress in a way that you don't normally dress. So why is a Sunday morning any different? Why on Sunday do you need to dress like Skater Boy or whatever, right?
Like you're going scuba diving.
Yeah, or like you're going scuba diving. But I scuba dive. It's a part of who I am. I wear my dry suit
now
when I go to church.
If you did that for that reason, that would be idolatrous, I believe.
That would just be outlandish, is what it would be.
I think so. There's one point I want to make that's very important, which is that all of this conversation illustrates that there's nothing unique about the whole vaccine issue with respect to our tendency as human beings to pursue false gods and worship idols, okay? There's nothing unique about it at all. It's just that it's a little more... it's kind of the new kid on the block, and it's caught a lot of people by surprise and provides an opportunity for sort of a wake-up call to be like, do you see here how easy it is for us to suddenly start sticking our identity in other things? Mm-hmm. And we've actually been doing that in many other ways all along, and we weren't aware of it because it was just the way things were, and it wouldn't occur to you to care. But now it's like you actually have to make a decision about this, and you have to think about it, and you have to understand why does it feel the way that it feels, et cetera, et cetera. And so to me, it's just an opportunity to look at a much broader spectrum of issues.
Yeah.
And
so that was my thought, dwelling on a little bit with that Bill C4.
Oh man, do we have time for this? How?
I was thinking
into
there's probably
The
a few
plane's
minutes-
taking off again.
There's probably a few minutes at the beginning we could cut out there where it was really quiet and we were just getting going. I was thinking about that a little bit, so we won't dive into the whole bill, but I was thinking about that for a minute where I go, well, how many other things are there that are written in the Bible that we already really can't? Maybe not under, well, like you say, just a matter of how well they're enforced. How many things are there already that we technically can't really say in church that would be sort of considered hate crime or something like that?
Yeah,
I mean, these things they're all there.
that's true.
But
Bill
which is now
C4
this has
that's
gotten
right.
a lot of
Yeah,
airtime now.
that's
where
right.
we're
Bill
going,
C4 makes it feel scarier, but the reality is we've already been under tremendous pressure, and people have already. Wow, there was actually a guy. I never did find out what happened to. There was a whole documentary about him, like 15 years ago, maybe even longer. A guy who himself was homosexual, who somehow or another decided he didn't want to be, didn't think it was right, and went, was kind of a very vocal sort of protester and would go all over the place with signs that said, things like homosexuality is a sin. And he was charged with hate speech, and I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and I can't remember what his name was or what happened to it. But the point is, that was long before any Bill C4. So it's like, the idea that you could be charged, and have to
This
go
is
all the
not
way to
new.
the Supreme Court because you said something you believed to be biblical about something is a sin, and that you ran afoul of the law as a result. It's like,
well, there was some church folk down at
It's not
church in Wellesley one fine June afternoon during a certain public event, and they got arrested. Peaceful, just standing there with signs. They weren't talking to anybody. Nothing.
Yeah.
Police came, arrested them, took them away. Disturbing the peace or
Disturb-
whatever.
Exactly. So
It's
Yeah.
all there. I mean, if they really want to
it's
exercise
the point.
it,
Yeah, exactly. It's been going on for a long time. We've all been kind of sleeping, and then Bill C4 comes along, and a few more people are waking up because it's like, holy smokes, this.
These are all just the death by 1,000 cuts is what these are. Really, it's just the beast is rearing its head and showing its true colors. But I mean, the fact is, this isn't new. We've been on this road a long time.
Yeah.
So. Well, we're well over the hour. I mean, I don't know if we really come to any final conclusions here, but
I did just want to say, I want to just stress that the issue really revolves around identity, and I think that's what you really brought out with the issue of, the T-shirts and stuff like that. And what I was going to say, because you were talking about how you're somehow saying what's the most important thing about me, and there's a context. In some contexts, it's very important that somebody know that I am a man, and in other contexts, it's really irrelevant whether I'm a man or a woman, right? So. And there's different ways we communicate those aspects of our identity in different contexts for where they matter. So when you think about something like, we actually call it an ID, an identity, driver's license is a form of ID. Mm-hmm. And you might go someplace where in a certain moment of that interaction, the most important thing about you is how old you are. Mm-hmm. And so you have to produce some kind of proof of your age. And so what that's saying is
I don't go places like that, Ambrose. When does that happen?
You're gonna had a beer in a restaurant. Anyways, right? So it's like there's something about your identity that's very important in that situation. Yeah. And so then I go, okay, is part of the story of who I am the fact that I have received a vaccination for COVID-19? Well, sure. That is part of the story of who I am. When is that little piece of the story of who I am important? When? And I look then what you're saying. So you got vaccinated because you're like, well, I got my measles, I got my whatever. It's just like you just took it as there's a health system that I am a part of. It's kind of an institution within our society and culture, and it just has all these different kind of moving parts that I've just never questioned and always gone along with. And so this vaccine just fits into that system, and it's just part of the system, and I just do the things of the system because it's how we have a healthy life. Okay, perfect. What's different, though, because then you're saying, why is the COVID vaccine different from a measles vaccine? And it's on some level, it shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be different. It's in the same way that never has anyone ever cared whether or not I have a measles vaccine. It should just never be relevant whether or not I have a COVID vaccine.
I don't have to go around proving that I've been vaccinated for polio.
Right? Now people will say, well, you do have to prove it in schools. They want to see your kids' vaccination records. And it's like, Yeah, that's true. I'm not saying there would never be a time when somehow,
But
there's
it's not
when I
the-
go
it's
see
not
my
the
doctor.
most important thing.
Right, and when I go see my doctor, they're going to want to look at my chart, and they're going to want to see those are going to be relevant points about the story of who I am. And my doctors will be like, oh, I see you've been vaccinated for COVID. Excellent. Okay, that's good. That's part of the story of who you are that's relevant to this particular relationship and this exchange. But outside of a very few different circumstances, where I actually think then all vaccination status would apply for any vaccine you've had, right? So things like your doctor's appointment, things like, some public health survey, that they're trying to keep tabs on what's going on with our public health. Like, fine.
But societally, we've
other
turned
context.
this into...
Yeah. Where's the context where it needs to be on my T-shirt? Where is that context?
I saw an article come up about, I guess, Joe Rogan's... He comes up on my feed quite a lot. The guy makes waves, but he's doing an all meat diet or something as of New Year's, and so they're going Rogan, the unvaccinated, or something like the unvaccinated show host. How do we sum up Joe Rogan? He's a show host. He's unvaccinated. That's his identity. That's how we know who he is.
Did it say unvaccinated or did it say anti-vax? Because that's the other problem.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I think you're right. Anti-vax.
Well, and that's the other way you know that there's an identity issue at stake is the fact that the label anti-vax even is a label.
Yeah,
it's like that you're.
Why does it matter if I don't like it?
You're ascribing a value system and something, and you're projecting it onto people because you don't even really know what their issue is. Yeah. But you're kind of like taking this. It's like a whole constellation of stuff. It's not even just the fact of their status. Did you hear this
thing that Trudeau said? This is going around. He was at some. Apparently, it was at something in Montreal, and he made some comment about most. There's basically a high correlation between unvaccinated or anti-vax people and misogyny and racism. They're often misogynistic and racist, and we have to ask ourselves, how long do we tolerate these people?
Yeah.
Bring out the friggin' furnaces.
Well, that right there also shows you that the
what do you do
idolater
instead of tolerating people?
But that also shows you the
right.
fact that you're lumping vaccination sentiment, even let alone status, in with things like racism and misogyny, like as if these are all things that belong
together. He likes Pepsi, not Coke.
Well, this isn't the first time we've seen this. They did the same thing in the summer of 2020 during the Black Lives Matter protests, where people were going, hold on a second, we've got public health restrictions that say you can't get together in large gatherings. You've shut down protests where they're protesting things like they don't want to wear masks. You've literally shut those down. How come these protests are allowed and the public health officials...
It would be an act of racism.
What the public health officials said was systemic racism is a public health concern, so it's okay. And it's like, well, hold on a second. COVID is a public health concern, and systemic racism is a public health concern. I feel like there's a kind of an inbreeding going on between these various sort of like political discursive contexts. And it's like... That tells you something. Yeah, the fact that Trudeau would lump that all together and be like, you see how it's all part of a... It's like, no, you see how you're turning this whole question of vaccination.
If you're vaccinated, you like black people, and if you're not, you're a racist misogynist.
Yeah, it's like, so you're creating these false identities anyways, and then ascribing, somehow mapping vaccination onto that. Anyways, what was I trying to say about all that? Oh yeah, why is it on a T-shirt? When does it need to be on a T-shirt? Never. In the same way that, yes, I get it. I have to show ID in order to buy a drink at a restaurant because you want to know my age and it's relevant to the laws and to the things. Yeah, I get it. But it's not... I would never put on my T-shirt my age. Why would I do that? It doesn't make any sense.
But it is about identity. And that's one of the things that's so hard now about this idea of mandatory vaccinations, like in the face of evidence that people who are vaccinated are still getting the disease, they're still transmitting the disease, like they're still getting sick, they're still going to the hospitals, they're still going to the ICU, they're still dying. In the face of all that, people are requiring us to adopt this identity of being vaccinated.
Right, and that's what it is. Because actually, that's what I was going to say. People are not only offended if you don't get vaccinated. If you say the things you just said, all you have to do is say something like, well, it's not clear to me that vaccines actually change your circumstance with respect to COVID. Like, you can still get it, you could still end up in the hospital. Yeah. If you say that, that it's almost more offensive to say that sacrilegious thing than it is to not be vaccinated.
Well, and that's the other thing
Like-
that I have.
Like, what's that? You know?
Yeah, that's I think evidence. And this is for another podcast, I think, because we're getting along. But that, I think, is evidence that there's a religion around this. There's a secular religion around this that I believe is in direct competition with Christianity. And we can talk about that next time if you want.
But it's. I think that's the way you worded it a second ago, though, is right. Where you said, it's not just that they want you to get vaccinated. They want you to adopt an identity of a vaccinated person.
That's right.
And those two things are not the same.
And if you don't,
Right.
you can't eat in restaurants, you can't travel, you can't leave the country,
Right.
you can't have a job.
Right. Yeah, you have to be known as a vaccinated person. It's not enough that you just are vaccinated. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
who's going to pray for us?
That's true. My goodness. Lead us not into idolatry.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Go for it, Dan.
Dear Lord, we thank you for time to dwell, to converse, to use our God-given minds to discern. Thank you for this time. Thank you for conversation, and we just pray that it would, bless those that hear it, and would be uplifting, and hopefully it doesn't bring them down too much. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.